Thank you, President. I'll probably have trouble following that. But I rise to speak on the Parliament Appropriations Bill, and my colleague, Mr Quilty, will cover some key aspects of the bill that have concerned the Liberal Democrats. But I'd like to add a few brief comments of my own. Firstly, I'd like to thank the parliamentary staff that have done such a wonderful job this year under trying circumstances with changes to our work arrangements. I'd also like to thank my own staff and all the electorate officers that work for MPs. I know that not only have they had to deal with very trying work circumstances through working from home and this sort of thing, and loneliness and this sort of thing, but many of the calls coming into our offices and the issues that constituents have had to get help with have been very emotional and serious and very distressing in some circumstances. So I think that they deserve some thanks from all Victorians for the work that they do in connecting constituents with Parliament. I'd also like to highlight the work of the parliamentary committees who've continued their important work managing the challenge of having witnesses provide testimony remotely. These committees are one of the most important functions of our Parliament, where diverse members can thrash out important issues that affect Victorians, and I've had the privilege of being involved in a number of these inquiries. I often question whether taxpayers are getting good value for money from government spending, but this doesn't apply to Parliament staff, and particularly the staff of the committees who have done a wonderful job, in my opinion. This bill also funds, as has been pointed out, Victoria's integrity agencies, so the Victorian Ombudsman Office, the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission and the Victorian Inspectorate and the Auditor General's Office. It also funds the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is a great asset to this Parliament, especially for members of the crossbench that do not always have access to the resources required to develop and inform policies introduced to further debate in this place. And my colleague Tim Quilty and I have used their services to come up with some very interesting research on a number of topics. While all of these are important agencies, IBAC and the Victorian Ombudsman have been working hard and doing very important work in recent years. Democracies have been challenged this year. Many people have lost faith in the integrity of governments. And without these agencies being appropriately funded and well supported, allegations of corruption or malfeasance would be impossible to refute. And some of the work being conducted by the Ombudsman's Office include an investigation into allegations of branch stacking misconduct and other matters in collaboration with IBAC. And this investigation will look into allegations of serious misconduct and corruption involving Victorian public officers. I'm sure we can all agree that a swift resolution to this matter will benefit the function of this Parliament, and my fellow representative in the South East Metropolitan region, Mr Somyurek, can resume his duties after this is finished. And I'm sure we'll all look forward to his contributions next year. Another investigation, the Ombudsman's Office has also received more than 550 complaints about financial grants to support small business during the pandemic, which they are investigating. These grants are managed by the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions. Given the large volume of complaints, the Ombudsman has decided to investigate to see if the department has made errors. This may allow for the Ombudsman to assist the department in improving its practices and procedures for receiving and managing applications for grants. And this was a predictable aspect that was internationally highlighted at the start of the pandemic, and it should come as no surprise that with so much money being spent, so much taxpayers' money being spent at the moment, the opportunities for corruption have increased exponentially. With programs rapidly established by a public service working remotely, there has never been a more important time for appropriate scrutiny and oversight. IBAC has already been investigating allegations of serious corruption involving contracts related to cleaning in the Victoria's public transport sector, as other members have highlighted. Without appropriate resourcing, we could miss allegations of corruption. The Ombudsman is currently also investigating the treatment of public housing tenants in lockdown. The investigation is specifically into the treatment of public housing tenants at 33 Alfred Street, North Melbourne. These residents were placed into hard lockdown for nearly a fortnight due to the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The investigation is intending to respond to the immediate concerns of residents and advocates, emphasising the need for access to medical supplies, fresh air, exercise or other everyday needs. It will also explore the broader issue of how to protect people's human rights when they are detained in lockdown, an issue very dear to my heart. And I think that it's important to point out that a speedy resolution to this investigation, God forbid if we have more outbreaks in Melbourne, this sort of information that we can learn from what's happened during the lockdowns will be absolutely essential in future responses to these outbreaks. And I won't mention every investigation or inquiry that's currently being conducted. Suffice to say that this year has created additional demand for the services of this office. In the quarterly highlight published by IBAC, the CEO, Malo Baragwanath, highlighted the additional risk of corruption during a crisis, stating, and I'll quote, "Significant funding and other measures are being progressively announced and implemented by all levels of government in response to the pandemic, in addition to funding committed for bushfire recovery. Experience tells us that changes to the way government services are delivered during times of crisis can create or heighten misconduct and corruption risks. They need to respond in a timely manner, coupled with remote work arrangements and pressing demands present new opportunities and risks for corruption," end quote, and I couldn't agree more. As my colleague Mr Quilty has spoken about many times and will likely talk about again, the Liberal Democrats have introduced a motion earlier this year which was supported by this House to implement the recommendations of the 2018 inquiry into IBAC. It's unlikely that you'll hear me call for more government funding very often during my time here, but when it comes to funding for our integrity agencies, the taxpayers get good value for money. Government needs to be accountable to the people and not just at election time. It's taken some time, but I'm pleased that the government has now committed to implementing all of the recommendations, in addition to the recommendations from the recent Royal Commission into the management of police informants. While this commitment from the government is a good one and will improve the functioning of Victoria Police and hopefully restore some confidence in the police, I'm concerned that the government has not adequately funded both the Ombudsman's Office and IBAC in this bill. This is not the time to shortchange our integrity bodies. While the Liberal Democrats will always support the efficient operation of government agencies, concerns have been raised by both of these agencies that they do not have the resources to conduct the work that we expect of them. The Liberal Democrats will be supporting the suggested amendments proposed by the opposition. Given the vast sums of money being spent in this budget, they are very reasonable and modest additions, and I believe the government should restore this funding to an appropriate level. The scrutiny of matters related to the pandemic response should not be unnecessarily delayed.
Thank you, Mr Quilty.
Thank you, President. I will be brief. This year's budget will cost Victorians more than any previous budget. Over the next year, government will expand by almost a full quarter and will spend $85 billion, or $34,750 per household. Despite this, the government has starved our anti-corruption bodies of funding. The Victorian Ombudsman has been allocated $2 million less than it spent last year. Ombudsman Deborah Glass, whose job is to investigate government misbehaviour, says this certainly looks like it's an attempt to undermine her office. The Ombudsman is the office that investigates things like branch stacking, treatment of public housing tenants in lockdown, and the dispensation of grants programs. One can only imagine why this government would want to undermine such investigations. Ombudsman Glass said she sometimes feels that governments fund their Ombudsman as little as they can get away with. She's talking about a history of underfunding from both Labor and Liberal governments. This is a pattern of behaviour. Those in power create anti-corruption bodies to give the appearance of integrity, but do everything they can to make those organisations ineffective. The Ombudsman is not the only anti-corruption office this government is trying to suffocate. The independent, broad-based Anti-Corruption Commission has also noted that it does not have the resources to investigate the claims of corruption and government misbehaviour put before it. Earlier this year, this House passed the Liberal Democrats' motion demanding an increase in IBAC funding, not only so it could properly investigate political corruption, but to expand the areas it could investigate to include reports of police corruption as well. This government has not only ignored the will of this House and refused to expand funding, but has set itself on depriving IBAC of these funds that it needs to fulfil its current obligations. Casey Council is not the only council that John Woodman has been involved in. I am told there are outstanding issues requiring investigation in Melton, for example. And John Woodman is not the only one who is apparently treating council development processes as their own personal cash machine. The number of councils needing investigation urgently far exceeds the funds available. I'm sure it's clear to everybody in this House that I'm not a fan of increased government spending. But I make an exception when it comes to funding the integrity agencies. Corruption is a cancer that eats at the fabric of our society. While this could be improved by reducing the level of government regulation that in turn creates the opportunities for corruption to be so profitable by taking the sugar off the table, as long as we have these opportunities in place for corruption, we must have anti-corruption bodies to fight it. Robert Redlich, the IBAC Commissioner, highlighted critical underfunding back in July and said that resource shortages would hamper IBAC's ability to complete a growing number of investigations. One might wonder why the list is growing. Let's put this in perspective. Our Ombudsman is asking for $2 million in additional funding. This government is going to spend $232 million every day over the next year. That's $9.7 million every hour. The $2 million of funding the Ombudsman needs represents only 12 minutes of Victorian government spending. Yet our government says we can't afford it. Earlier this year, the Treasurer said that he'd found $4 billion of government waste that could be used for other purposes. According to our Treasurer, our government was wasting 200 times the amount needed to fund the Ombudsman, but he still can't find the money to fund it. At the time, I asked the Treasurer where these savings had been found, and I was told I'd have to wait for the budget to find out. Now we know at least where $2 million of the savings have come from, and we know this government sees integrity as a waste of time and money. I won't accept that there's no room in the budget to fund integrity bodies. This government claims that taxpayers can afford record expenditure, but can't afford the integrity bodies to ensure the spending is honest. Well, I say if you can't afford to ensure your grants programs aren't just another sports-wrought debacle, then you can't afford your grants programs. And the same goes for the rest of government expenditure. If you can't afford to show that it's above board, you can't afford it. It's as simple as that. The Liberal Democrats are proud to stand against corruption and to demand adequate funding for integrity bodies before funding is directed elsewhere.